This is Delhi. Please stand by for our next program. This is All India Radio. On the occasion of International Women's Day, in our national program of talks tonight, we bring you a panel discussion entitled Changing Climates, Equality Today for a Sustainable Tomorrow. The panelists are Shriti Pandey, Civil Engineer and Architect promoting green buildings, Kriti Tula, Innovative Fashion Designer, Tanushree Ganguly, Program Lead, Council on Energy, Environment and Water, New Delhi, and Anando Chakrabarti, Media Personality, who initiates and moderates the discussion.
Hi, welcome all of you and welcome our listeners. The topic for today's discussion is International Women's Day 2022, Changing Climates, Equality Today for a Sustainable Tomorrow. As I was saying, and I was wondering, the odd man out here, because I am in the company with three young women of eminence who in their own capacities are involved with creating sustainable tomorrow. With me in the studio is Tanushree Ganguly, an air quality expert with some commendable experience at the Center for Science and Environment and now with the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. We also have with us Kriti Tula, a unique fashion designer in her own right, who uses discarded waste cloth from factories to create her unique items of sustainable fashion. I'd like to have one of your pieces someday. And then, of course, Shriti Pandey, who is a well-known architect who builds sustainable homes from agricultural waste. A warm welcome to all of you. So what is it that motivated you to do what you're doing now? Tanushree, with you first.
So I grew up, in a township where close to 200 families coexisted together.
Mm-hmm.
And we basically moved into a town which was developing at that point in time.
What town was that?
This was Surat.
Okay.
Surat, 20, 25 years back. It's not Surat that we know now.
Mm-hmm.
It's among the best and the cleanest cities in the world today.
Mm-hmm.
But when we moved in, it was still, a budding town.
Mm-hmm.
I remember as a kid, we'd have to make frequent visits to the hospital.
Mm.
I was diagnosed with severe asthma. And, doctors would say that trigger agents could range from perfume to dust, difficult time sort of playing with other kids, was never really athletic, couldn't afford to be athletic. And because, there were 200 families, everybody was also generating sort of a lot of waste. And I would see that all of this waste, unsegregated, of course, would end up in this open dump. It was a very good colony. It was a plush colony with educated people. But still, the waste would end up going to this open sort of a dump. Good student, did engineering, did civil engineering actually. Honestly, civil engineering was fun, but it wasn't really my calling. I never felt that, it was my calling. The couple of subjects that I liked during my course curriculum were related to, waste management and environmental engineering. So I thought that, this is quite natural. I'm going to go ahead and get like a master's in environmental engineering. Did my master's in environmental engineering, ended up becoming an environmental consultant, worked in a boutique firm in the US for about a year. I was enjoying, but still that calling, I was not yet able to find my calling. And then came like a big blow in my life. I couldn't get my work permit in the US. And I had to come back. And I had absolutely no clue where to begin my job hunt from. And that's when I chanced upon this opening at the Center for Science and Environment, which worked out. I was at the Center for Science and Environment for about 1.5 years. I also wanted to contribute to institutional building. And that's how I landed up at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. Having been at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, I've not just worked towards doing stuff on air quality, but also conceptualizing.
Okay. Shriti, how did you come to do what you're doing, building sustainable homes?
So I actually studied civil engineering in bachelor's too, then studied design and construction management in my master's from New York, US. Got my work permit, but decided to let it go and moved back in 2016 in India. And that time I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I just didn't want to do any corporate job and I moved back to India. And a friend of mine just told me coincidentally that there's a fellowship. It's like a 13-month immersive rural fellowship. And I decided why not. So I didn't tell my parents or anybody. I quit my job, interviewed for the fellowship, got in, came back, landed in Delhi and directly went to this village called Pandhana in Madhya Pradesh. It's a tribal village there. And I lived there for one full complete year.
Okay.
You don't have any holidays in those fellowships. It's just structured that way.
Okay.
And it was a chance that I happened to see stubble burning happening.
Mhm.
Till then, because I had lived and studied in Delhi, I would always see it in the news channels.
Mhm.
But that was my first experience witnessing wheat straw being burned. This was not paddy, which happens in
Mhm.
Punjab and Haryana. And that just made me really curious that, it's another fiber. Why are they burning it? Because they are not even like the largest producer in terms of the state or capacity. And I had a lot of free time in the village, and Geo had just launched, so there was ample amount of free internet. So I could research, and I came to know that India was just, burning not just paddy, but almost all major byproduct of cereal crops
Mhm.
in a quantity which is just like it's 500 million metric ton. I can't even still visualize what that would seem like. And that just made me think that why not mix that with construction? Because based on my engineering and architecture background, I knew that straw, wood, these natural materials are always better to work with. They're more thermally, acoustically insulated, they're non-toxic. So I thought, why not we make like a sophisticated version of this straw, not in the loose form, because that doesn't garner any confidence from people. So then after the fellowship got open, I started my own company, which is a green building material company in 2018. And what we do is we compress that residue into engineered panels, which can then replace your drywall, your brick wall, your false ceiling, flooring, everything with that material, which is fireproof, termite resistant. And yeah, that's just been the journey for the last 3 years, working with this raw material and
Fantastic.
understanding.
Fantastic. So I'll come back to you and pick your mind on that. Kriti, so how did you come to do what you're doing? I mean, fashion is fine. I'm sure you studied
Yes.
fashion designing.
Yes.
But then getting into something which is using discarded waste cloth from
Yes.
factories
Yes.
to make what you make. What do you make?
We work with a range of lifestyle products, right? From clothing to shoes to bags, pretty much everything that would be defined under the lifestyle space. And we want to sort of continue to grow and create more things out of wastages from factories. And like you said, I did my, undergraduation in fashion. And, like every kid who dreams about being a designer, they have like a lot of hopes when they're thinking about, I'm going to design clothes. And there's so much emotion attached to every garment you make, right? This is where my concept's going to be. This is like how you're writing a book. So you have to imagine things and you have to come up with ideas. And as soon as you join the industry, you realize nobody cares about it. Because, that personal relationship with your clothing, the industry has worked over years to break. That you don't get attached to your clothes. You throw them away, you buy new clothes, you change garments with every trend that comes in. And that is how they make you come back to the stores. But that in turn creates so much wastage because in general, garments are not something that gets disposed of easily. They don't biodegrade easily. Most of them are blended material with plastic and cotton. So it just made no sense when I actually joined the industry to keep making and creating in this linear model, which is when I then sort of got into researching about what does fashion industry look like at scale, what kind of wastages we're producing, and the quantities, like Shriti pointed out, it's one thing on paper, but it's not something that most people can sort of imagine. Each factory that we were working with at that point, and I was only interning, and if you sit with the numbers, it sort of says that each factory at a large scale is currently making or wasting 1,500 to 2,000 garments on a daily basis because they're rejected for quality, for misprints, for stitching. Then there are cut wastages. There are fabric, fiber, yarn that are wasted within the production process. And each factory, while they're wasting, say, about 1,500 to 2,000 garments a day, they're also wasting, say, about 45,000 meters of fabric waste, which is just, discards, fabrics, etc. And that takes a lot of resources to make. So, and how fashion sort of is connected to air, to water, to all kinds of pollution. Because for cotton growing itself, you take about 2,800 liters of water to make a t-shirt. That was just appalling. And it got me more interested into recycled and sustainable fashion alternatives.
One thing which is emerging and which I am gathering and getting enlightened by is, apart from being qualified professionals in a domain, I mean, this is a generation of visionary thinkers who are thinking different from the run of the mill, which would have earned them money anyways. But then you're trying to do something different, which is encouraging. Now, that brings me to something very different. I mean, there's always this divide between the haves and the have-nots. I mean, I look at you and say, in a sense, visionaries that you are, and there are many others who sort of share your platform today. That's one section of India's women today.
Mm-hmm.
There is this other section who are impoverished, who are marginal farmers, small-time farmers, who have to burn their stubble to make their fields ready for the next sowing. Now, when we talk about energy and the role of women in a sustainable future, we need to talk about these women in particular. And Tanushree, I'll pick your brain on this and ask you to place your views on this.
No, absolutely. And, it's quite strange. Every time we think about biomass burning, we always think about stubble because, stubble burning has become villain number one for Delhi's air pollution. But biomass is just not stubble. And the Indo-Gangetic Plain sees bitter winters. Delhi, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, we see bitter winters, right? And the cerebral visionary woman that, you've been referring to perhaps have the potential to get themselves a room heater as well as an air purifier. But then when I also step out and, go to the shanties, which are very close to my locality, I see that people are still using firewood to make their food, also to provide themselves the heat. So there is a clear divide. And I mean, as much as we think about air pollution in terms of stubble burning or, the diesel exhausts guzzling or industries and thermal power plants, in India, air pollution is a problem of energy access and energy poverty.
I think we are talking about situations where access to energy. Now, could you define, is this access to energy we are at the governmental level working towards giving them access to clean energy?
Right.
How far has it reached them?
Before I get to that part, I mean, just to kind of help everyone and the listeners fathom the scale of the problem, about 30% of India's particulate pollution, I mean, when we talk about air pollution, it's PM 2.5, comes from biomass burning. And this is inclusive of trash or, biomass which is used for cooking. Now, in terms of clean energy access for households, the government has actually started providing free LPG connections under the Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana. Now, getting a connection and using LPG are two separate things, right? So the number of connections have certainly gone up since the Ujjwala program came out in 2016. So there are households which, even though they primarily use liquefied petroleum gas cylinders, but they are still relying on solid fuels. And there are households which actually primarily use solid fuel for cooking, but then use the LPG as like a substitute fuel for their cooking needs. Now, cooking is just one part of energy access. The other part of energy access is water heating, especially winters.
Yeah.
The other part is space heating. Okay. That your LPG cylinder cannot really, take care of. And that's where the energy access challenge becomes all the more pronounced.
So, Shriti, coming to you now, first of all, let's define for our audience, what do we mean by sustainable homes?
So I primarily think that sustainability, like if you're talking about a building being sustainable, it has to be affordable. And the resources that go into it has to be local. As localized as you can get in terms of sourcing your resources, and by that definition would vary terrain, topography, will actually make it sustainable. And there's this huge divide that, sustainability is like a luxury that everyone cannot afford. But actually, if you're using local resources, if you're using discarded waste that nobody cares about, such as stubble or waste fabric, that raw material to you as a manufacturer is available at a lower cost. For us as a company, it's available at a lower cost, which is why we can compete with the traditional material and tell the mass consumers and not just the 2% of the country that you can build your offices, healthcare and homes with these structures.
Since you're an entrepreneur now, let me ask you this question. Who is buying into this sustainable construction?
So I started out with this naive idea that I can just directly go to the end customer, which we tried for a year, and we realized that, the end user doesn't know so much about design and materials. The architect knows, the structural engineers knows. So after failing for a year and just having two customers, we then went to the architects and the builders directly and started convincing the architects in the industry in major tier 1, tier 2 cities that, this is a better comparative durable material to what you're using. And it was them that started specifying it to the end user. So our customers are architects right now, whether it is a home that someone is building or office or a commercial structure.
Is it meaning good business for you now?
We have been bootstrapped for last 3 years, profitable. When despite COVID, we've been able to, run our organization and grow from 2 people to 20 right now.
Okay.
So definitely, in terms of economics, yes. it works for us. But now we're looking to scale up and making it more available locally, which, going back to my previous answer, doesn't mean sending it from one factory from, let's say, Punjab all the way down to Bangalore, but setting up a small factory in Bangalore, providing that market, that raw material.
There's hope on the horizon because people are buying into this technology, therefore. Now, Kriti, we come to you now. And could you elaborate a little on what exactly you're doing in terms of using waste material from factories that you're talking about?
So when you look at garment construction, there is wastage that happens. We started working with post-production wastages, which hasn't reached the consumer. So we would look at fabric wastages from larger factories and convert them into limited edition collections of garments of different kinds of products that will fall under the category of lifestyle. Step 2 for us was to look at recycled material. So for a while now in India, there has been recycling of post-consumer waste, which is garments basically that are used that can further be shredded and converted back into yarns and then woven into garments and fabrics again, which again ends up saving a lot of resources that would go into making virgin material. And then finally, we're a zero waste firm as well. So everything that we waste further is processed into making, say, paper for our packaging or is shredded further to make new yarns and things like that.
How are you marketing?
So I think within the fashion industry, there has been a lot of consumers that have started thinking about sustainable alternatives for clothing just after sustainable alternatives for food.
What I'm asking is, see, at the industry level, of course, there are people like you and others who share the platform. At the consumer level, is the consumer today aware and buying into your kind of stuff because they're more environment friendly? They're using waste materials?
So I would say about even now, there's about 40% of our users actually buying for a conscious choice into sustainability. 60% of our consumer is just buying doodlish because it looks the way it does and they're happy to sort of, just buy, and instead of buying a fashion brand or any other dress, they buy a dress with a story, let's say. But at least 40% of consumer today, from where we started, when everybody questioned us as to why you do what you do exactly, what is the need of this particular stream in fashion? So since then, we've come a long way, especially in India.
Can I ask a question to Kriti though?
You could, yeah. Quick one.
Quick one.
Yes.
How do you measure the proportion of consumers who actually buy it because it's like a recycled garment, and the proportion of consumers
So
who
we've
buy
seen that change over a period of time and amongst the consumer. Initially, we were working with third-party stores and we weren't really so close to the consumer themselves and we didn't realize who's buying what's buying. But over the period of time, since our major sales rely on our website directly, so then we started talking to them a lot more.
Let me come back to you, Tanushree. And come every winter, we talk of air quality. Dangerous, threatening. I mean, from an expert's point of view, you've been making recommendations, I'm sure. Do you see light at the end of the day? Are things beginning to change?
We always talk about air pollution only during the winters. I think that's one thing that we need to get straight. It's a year-round problem. The permissible limit is 60 and the average is 90. So we're about 1.5 times more polluted than how we should be throughout the year. Now, the government introduced something called the National Clean Air Program in 2019. And under the aegis of the National Clean Air Program, which has now become the National Clean Air Mission, the government is actually taking measures to improve air quality. Now, air pollution is a game of data, implementation of scalable solutions, and enforcement. The focus right now has primarily been on generating the kind of data which is needed to diagnose the problem. Implementation is beginning, enforcement is still lacking. So that's where we are.
Has the process of reining in industries really beginning to take effect?
Again, I'm going to use the same framework to respond to that question. Data, implementation, enforcement. Now, all the industries, the large-scale industries, which we call the red category industries, are actually required to be very transparent about the amount of emissions that they are putting out into the air. Now, for a lot of industries, this data is actually available publicly. So you and I can actually see that, if this is an industry which is pretty close to me, about 100 kilometers from my house, this is the kind of emission that's coming out. Now, that's a tool which, our regulatory authorities need to leverage to strengthen their hold on industries. That is not happening as much. So there is the infrastructure in place for the data to be generated, but what do we do with the data? That's where the enforcement comes in. So that's where it's a bit lacking. Other bit on energy transition. Again, it's an energy access problem. Your large-scale industries could potentially transition, but what about your small, micro-scale enterprises? Who pays for the energy transition? Should an industry, let's say in Ballabgarh, transition because folks in Delhi think that the air quality is bad? So that's the dynamic. That's the power dynamic that's here. So any environmental challenge, for that matter, has to be looked at through the lens of data transparency. How is the data being leveraged for action? And then how strong is the enforcement?
Okay, let me come back to the architect amongst us. Now, of course, you are known for using sustainable resources to build, in the construction industry. Now, construction industry has been considered to be one of the black sheep, okay, insofar as damaging the environment and climate change, etc. I am not being a cynic. Is the construction industry today, in general, waking up to the fact that they need to quickly implement more efficient ways of construction which are less damaging to the environment?
Construction is one industry where, the only metric that works is cost. So if you can sort of tangibly demonstrate that using a more cleaner or a sustainable technology actually reduces your cost, is the only language that sort of gets the customer, who might be a builder or an architect, to convert. Buildings do, in terms of data, contribute 1/3. Now, when we do talk about these green buildings, I personally believe that we are still just focusing on, few aspects such as energy. That's one thing that, is very important, but we are touching, but people are not even talking about the embodied carbon footprint that buildings have. People don't even understand what that means, because that's the footprint that is locked.
Let me stop you there, and for the benefit of listeners, for my benefit. What did you say? Embodied?
So there are two kinds of footprint that a building can generate.
Yeah.
One is operational carbon footprint and another is embodied. So operational is, the energy that you're using to run that place, the appliances. So that's throughout the life cycle of the building.
Yeah.
And then embodied is the footprint that goes in because of the choice of the materials that you mostly use to build the structure with.
Yeah.
Now that is day one decision that an architect or a builder takes. And you cannot 10 years later say, okay, now I'm going to demolish this building and reduce my embodied footprint. You won't. You cannot. You can't afford to, basically. So at the design level, similar to the fashion industry, you need to make that conscious decision to
choosing
change.
the right material.
Change, your decision of what you're consuming, what resources, from how far are they coming, actually transparently looking at the life cycle analysis of the material, which people don't even care about, or is not even a mandate in India yet to be, transparently, defined by companies.
One of the curious questions that I have in mind is there enough material resources available vis-a-vis mortar and brick to build scalable buildings today for urban use?
So India has more straw than wood. I always like to say that. We have more straw that we just don't require. Then the trees that we intentionally plant and affect the natural ecology that is there by, doing deforestation of trees that we actually require for the ecosystem balance. So we have enough. That is just one raw material that we are working with. But a lot of other sustainable material, for example, there's ramped earth technique. Now, mud isn't you naturally have earth. It's not going to go away. But still, you are synthetically making it in a factory or a cement. So when the moment you're choosing a natural material, by default, there's a decent, abundant amount of it is there available. So that's, I don't think, is the problem. The problem is, how do you tangibly explain it to the consumer or to the buyer, whoever's the decision maker, that, in the long run, this makes sense in terms of your indoor air quality, in terms of your cost, as well as just the general health of, everybody who's in.
So what you're trying to suggest, it's a matter of choice and it's a matter of making people realize. And today, if I want to build a 40-storied condominium, I can actually go ahead and access more eco-friendly material and build it.
Definitely, yes. There are buildings in Europe and Scandinavia who have worked with recycled lumber and they've built 25-story structures. You don't need concrete. You don't necessarily need steel to build.
Wow. So you have a very bright future. I can see that.
But it's interesting, and it's true that in all such industries that exist, that one, cost is a big factor, and two, the intention from the person who's making that building.
Well, we're running a little out of time, and I've got one question now. 3 women and working in niche areas, and we are talking about equality. Quickly, each one of you, how many women are involved in the kind of zone that you are in? Okay, choosing to work in environment, in the business of environment, or in environment-friendly technologies. Tanushree, beginning with you.
There is a significant number. In fact, where I work at, we run something called Women in Sustainability. The single purpose of Women in Sustainability is to ensure that there is participation of women in the workforce at every level.
Thank you. Yes.
And I think that participation is only increasing. Like most conferences or panel discussions that I am a part of, or group discussions or industry disruptor programs, I always see a lot more women participating than men. Which
Fashion,
is also,
yes, I'll give it, yes.
not just fashion.
Interestingly, I'll
Quick rejoinder here.
Yeah.
The important point here is at every level. We
Yes.
see women increasingly getting into the workforce. What we're not seeing enough is women in leadership roles. And that's a spot that we need to hit.
Yes.
Civil engineering, both of you are civil engineers, and has been a no-go zone for women, and is still largely very few women go for civil engineering. How many women in your kind of a domain who are working, in ecologically sustainable building material zone?
So unfortunately, my answer is not as optimistic as theirs. So I mean, there's decent amount of women in when it comes to the design, ecosystem like architecture and design. But if you get to like hardcore construction part of the business, where you're either into manufacturing or engineers, like in my company, I'm the only woman. I only meet men around me, whether at a site or mostly at the blue collar level, the people we work with to use the material and build.
How unfortunate. I mean, you still have to meet a man to talk about what you're doing. Now, I would sum it up this way. On the occasion of International Women's Day, we've had this discussion, and a very fruitful one. And we leave with some hope here that indeed, equality today for a sustainable tomorrow is beginning to have some bite, and the role of women is increasing every day. We leave the studio with a little hope, because I find women engaged in the business. There are women who are engaged in the business of conservation, even in the homes in the rural areas today. And so a sustainable tomorrow, which is more equal in the sense that women are participants in that and also engineers of growth, there is possible.
Absolutely. But again, women in leadership. We need women to lead. We need women to be decision makers.
Well, I'll let the woman have the last word. Thank you. Thank you all of you ladies for being with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
On the occasion of International Women's Day, in our national program of talks tonight, you just heard a panel discussion entitled Changing Climates, Equality Today for a Sustainable Tomorrow. The panelists were Shriti Pandey, civil engineer and architect promoting green buildings; Kriti Tula, innovative fashion designer; Tanushree Ganguly, program lead, Council on Energy, Environment and Water, New Delhi; and Anandu Chakravarti, media personality who initiated and moderated the discussion. This program was produced and presented by Naveen K. Gupta of All India Radio, Delhi, and was broadcast from the Delhi station of All India Radio.